What are major characteristics of Chinese painting from the Sui to the Yuan dynasties?
The range of Chinese art covered in this chapter is immense. And while it is difficult to summarize such a varied history into one answer, there are indeed important attributes common to many examples of Chinese painting from this time period. Unlike medieval painters in Europe, Chinese painters did not paint on wood panels. Instead, they painted on silk or paper, usually with water-based inks and colorful pigments. The practice of painting was considered an intellectual exercise with close ties to Confucian and Buddhist philosophies. Early Chinese paintings often exhibit a balance of seemingly spontaneous movement with thoughtful calm. Artists favored landscapes and nature scenes, as well as realistic figurative paintings.
What is minimalism?
Minimalism is a term that describes simple, geometric art that is often impersonal and made with a new set of materials, including aluminum, plexiglass, plywood, and steel. Minimalist artists attempted to distill their work into a pure form, editing any reference to personality, feelings, symbolism, or story. The style became popular during the mid-1960s, though many art critics at the time accused minimalism of being too cold, and questioned whether art could, or should, be produced by industrial means. The term minimalism has been used to describe the art of many artists. From Ad Reinhardt to Yves Klein, Frank Stella to Robert Rauschenberg. The work of artist Donald Judd, 1928 to 1994, is a good example of minimalism. Judd explored the difference between painting and sculpture with his series of wall structures. Judd's wall structures are composed of a series of machinamate rectangular forms that protrude from the wall. Forms that he called specific objects. The work of artist Anne Truitt, 1921 to 2004, occasionally blurred the line between minimalism and color field painting. However, her minimalist sculpture Grant 1963, a long wooden beam, painted in acrylic, was a pure, impersonal, geometric form.
Who were the Lorenzetti brothers?
The Lorenzetti brothers were Sienese painters who were influenced by the work of Duccio, the father of Sienese painting. Pietro, c.1280 c.1348, and Ambrogio, d.c. 1348, are known for their simple yet noble paintings and innovations in creating a sense of real space in their work. Ambrogio painted monumental frescoes depicting an allegory of both good and bad government in Siena's main civic building, the Palazzo Pubblico, in 1338. The allegory of good government in the city visually describes the benefits of a just government on its people by depicting an idealized Siena. The complex fresco, filled with beautiful, multicolored buildings and allegorical figures. Achieves a natural sense of scale between the figures and the environment. On a nearby wall in the palazzo, the allegory of bad government in the city shows. What can happen when a city loses its way? The personified figures of avarice, pride, and glory lurk above the head of a brutish ruler while the people of the city suffer.
Who was Michelangelo?
Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, was a multi-talented great master of the High Renaissance, known for his painting, sculpture, and architecture. He had an incredibly long and successful career, active for nearly 70 years. He was 20 years younger than Da Vinci and well respected during his lifetime. Though notorious for being moody and difficult to work with, he was one of the first artists in art history to be famous. 2 biographies were written about him, and he was highly sought after by high-status patrons, including Lorenzo de' Medici and the Pope. His most famous works include his painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and his awe-inspiring sculptures such as the Pietà, which he made when he was 24 years old, and the David. He also designed the dome on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, though he died before its construction was completed.
Who were the Pre-Raphaelites?
Also known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, this group, led by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, started out in 1848 as a secret society of students at the Royal Academy School in England who rejected the perceived materialism of the Victorian period as well as the teachings of the Academy. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which also included William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais, found the work of the 19th century Academy to be artificial and decadent, and instead preferred the simplicity and apparent sincerity of Renaissance masters such as Fra Angelico and Jan van Eyck. The Pre-Raphaelites also valued the moralistic themes of these artists and favored religious themes. Significant Pre-Raphaelite paintings include Hunt's The Awakening Conscience, 1853 to 1854, Millais Christ in the Carpenter's Shop, Christ in the House of His Parents, 1849 to 1850, and Rossetti's The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, 1849. The Pre-Raphaelites were greatly supported by the English art critic, John Ruskin, were sometimes characterized as romantic, and went on to influence the 174 aesthetic movement, the Symbolists, and Art Nouveau.
What is considered beautiful in Islamic art?
The Arabic word for beautiful is jamil. To be considered beautiful, Islamic art must be symmetrical, unified, and balanced. These aesthetic principles are also valued in classical Greek and Roman cultures. which influenced early Islamic art. An additional quality of Islamic art is that it should also be astonishing. The medieval philosopher Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazan, said visible objects are appealing due to the composition and order of their parts among themselves, as quoted in O'Reilly 25. This attitude towards beauty helps to explain why Islamic art is often so intricate and detailed, and yet balanced and harmonious.
How can you recognize a Michelangelo?
The work of Michelangelo has a very particular style, in both painting and sculpture. Michelangelo's David is a good example of this style, which emphasizes physical idealism of the human form, especially the male form. The David is monumental in size at 17 feet tall, and was cut from an 18-foot block of white marble. David is shown at the peak of his youth. He is strong, athletic, nude, and flexing his muscles as he prepares for battle with his enemy, Goliath. His hands and feet are both oversized and highly realistic. The veins and ligaments of the hands are clearly visible even from afar. One knee is slightly bent and the hips tilt to one side, the traditional contrapposto pose, which adds a sense of life and realism to the sculpture. Many of Michelangelo's other works also emphasize physical perfection and include large figures with broad shoulders, flexed muscles, and serious faces.
What is mannerism?
While many of the most successful artists of the early 16th century followed the classical aesthetic so popular during the Renaissance, not everyone did. Overall, Renaissance artists valued naturalistic representations of the ideal human, both physically and mentally, and art with balanced, symmetrical, and proportionate forms. It can come as a shock, therefore, to see work such as Bronzino's Algieri with Venus and Cupid, an erotic and slightly disturbing painting of Venus kissing her son, Cupid. The painting is filled with twisted, elongated figures. They appear weightless, limbs seem attached at odd angles, and the colors are off. Behind Cupid's contorted body, a woman screams, grabbing her hair. To the right, a cherub hurls flowers like a weapon. At his feet, theatrical masks depict ugly faces. Although allegory with Venus and Cupid may be a sensational example, it is certainly not the only early 16th century painting to exhibit such anomalies of naturalism. Other artists, including Pio Antormo, Parmigianino, and Benvenuto Cellini, favored what is known as the Mannerist style in Italy. The definition of mannerism is controversial, but it is generally thought of as an intellectual and rebellious alternative to the refined styles of High Renaissance. It is characterized by elongated figures in unstable poses, the use of pastel colors, and sometimes, sexual overtones. Mannerist art was popular amongst courtly, rather than religious, patrons. While the style developed in Italy, it was also popular in Northern Europe.
How can a slab of stone or a stretched canvas slathered in paint cost so much?
First, art is not only cultural object but also a commodity and is therefore affected by economic factors, such as supply and demand. This might account for the fact that the price of art often rises once the artist has passed away. Second, art is very much a luxury item and therefore a status symbol. The owner of Damien Hirst's $12 million preserved shark, officially titled The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, publicly demonstrates a great deal of wealth. It is perhaps the very fact that art serves no practical purpose that drives up the price.
Who was Giorgione?
Very little is known about the Venetian painter Giorgione. He was born in 1478 in the northern Italian town, Castelfranco. Was a student under Giovanni Bellini, and died of the plague in 1510. He was an innovative painter credited with ushering in the High Renaissance in Venice. He emphasized landscape in his work, which was popular in Venice at the time, and rendered both landscapes and portraits meaningful through the extensive use of symbolism. According to the writer Vasari, Giorgione was inspired by the sfumato technique used by Leonardo da Vinci, and preferred to draw directly on the canvas, rather than do preparatory drawings on paper. Attributing specific paintings to Giorgione is extremely difficult, and scholars have only confirmed 5 paintings as being from his hand. His most famous surviving painting, The Tempest, is of a forested landscape with a lightning storm in the background. A breastfeeding woman sits partially covered by some vegetation, while a red-jacketed solitaire watches her from afar. The mysterious painting enthralls scholars and other viewers, who continue to wonder at its meaning.
What is a cantilever?
An example of a cantilever is a balcony that projects from the side of a building, supported on one end by a vertical form, and freestanding on the other. A cantilever may seem as if it is freestanding, but is not. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright used cantilevers to dramatic effect in his design for Falling Water, a home in Pennsylvania.
What forms of medieval European art are there?
European art from the Middle Ages takes many forms. from metalwork to illustrated books to architecture and sculpture. Medieval artisans designed richly decorated jewelry, book covers, and church decorations. Books, some of the most important objects of the medieval world, were meticulously written and illustrated using precious inks and animals' skins. While much of the earliest medieval architecture was made of wood and no longer exists. Later Romanesque and Gothic buildings are some of the most beautiful and renowned examples of architecture in all of art history.
Where did art begin?
Most traditional art history survey textbooks and courses begin with the prehistoric art of Europe and the Near East. It is convention, as much as anything else, and fits within the mostly chronologic presentation of the history of art in this book. Do note, however, that art itself did not begin in Europe. There is no single place where art began. Examples of prehistoric art can be found around the globe.
Are there any good documentaries about art?
There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of documentaries about art and artists. One of the best recent documentaries is Simon Sharma's Power of Art, 2006, series, which does an excellent, and very entertaining, job of explaining the work of famous artists throughout history from the Renaissance to the 20th century. The PBS series Art, 21 is unparalleled in its presentation of art in the 21st century. Each episode of Art, 21, which is organized by theme, provides a look into the minds, and usually the studios, of artists working today. For a mix of Western and non-Western art, the series Art Through Time. A global view is also presented thematically, and includes information from art historians from around the world. It is often shown on local PBS stations. Check your local listings.
What is the ISE shrine?
The ISE shrine is an important Shinto complex in Japan dedicated to the goddess Amaterasu, ancestor of the Japanese emperors. Known as the Way of the Gods. Shinto may be considered a religion or a philosophy and is indigenous to Japan. Water purification rituals and worship of animistic local deities known as kami are fundamental aspects of Shinto. The ISE complex features a main shrine which has a thatched roof and is raised off the ground with wooden pilings. Made of unpainted cypress wood, the shrine style reflects natural simplicity. Historically, only members of the Japanese imperial family were allowed worship in ISE's interior sanctuary. Every 20 years, the main shrine is completely rebuilt on the site. an important political and religious ritual.
What is the Bauhaus?
The Bauhaus was a progressive art and design school established in Weimar, Germany, in 1919. With the goal of training art students to create works that blended artistry with commercialism. The school was home to some of the most well-respected and revolutionary artists, designers, and architects of the day, including Paul Klee, 1879–1940, Johannes Itten, 1888–1967, and Vasily Kandinsky, 1866–1944, who lived together on site in the specially designed school. The first director of the Bauhaus was Walter Gropius, 1889–1983. A renowned modern architect known for his interest in function. The courses covered both practice-based art training, on topics such as painting, furniture making, ceramics, bookbinding, metalworking, and eventually architecture, as well as more theoretical concepts including art historical analysis, color theory, and even meditation. Unlike many art schools, the Bauhaus included the applied arts in its curriculum and actively sought out design commissions, with the goal of creating art objects that blended art and craft. Students infused everyday objects with elements of high design. For example, Peter Kaleer's 1922 design for a cradle reflects both geometric simplicity and functional efficiency. The politically left-leaning Bauhaus began to lose funding as more conservative policies took hold in Germany during the 1920s. The school first moved to Dessau, and then to Berlin, but was eventually closed in the 1930s as the Nazis gained power. Many of the key Bauhaus leaders and faculty members, Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Joseph Albers, emigrated to the United States. The Bauhaus embrace of industrialism and its goal of creating functional design made an enormous impact on the art and architecture of the 20th century.
What is the difference between suprematism and constructivism?
Both suprematism and constructivism were art movements that developed in Russia in the early 20th century and promoted geometric abstraction, however. Unlike suprematism, constructivism promoted the idea that art had an important social function. The difference between the two is therefore primarily ideological, rather than aesthetic.
Who was Dominikus Zimmermann?
Dominikus Zimmermann, 1685–1766, was a German architect from Bavaria, who is famous for his 1757 design of Die Weiss, a Bavarian pilgrimage church whose name means the meadow. Located in the foothills of the Alps. Die Weiss is one of the best examples of Rococo design in the 18th century. While the exterior of the church is relatively plain and simple. The church awes the visitor upon entering, evoking a feeling of heaven. Overwhelmingly rich frescoes cover the walls and ceilings, and blend in with sculpture and stucco decoration. Trained to work in stucco, Zimmermann designed other important 18th-century churches in Germany, including Wallfahrtskirche, the pilgrimage church in Steinhausen, and the Frauenkirche, Church of Our Lady, in Günzburg.
What is the classical pantheon?
The ancient Greeks and Romans were polytheistic, which means that they believed in many gods, each with different attributes and personalities, and collectively referred to as the Greek and Roman pantheon. The human-like classical gods and goddess were frequently depicted in ancient art, and temples were built in their honor. Greek name, Roman name description: Zeus, Jupiter, ruler of the gods, often depicted holding a lightning bolt. Reigns from Mount Olympus, Hera, Juno, wife of Zeus and goddess of marriage. Often jealous as Zeus had many affairs, Aphrodite, Venus, goddess of beauty, love, and sex, mother of Cupid. Known for frequent love affairs with gods and mortals, Apollo, son of Zeus and twin brother to Artemis. God of the sun, music, archery, prophecy, and poetry, Athena, Minerva, patron goddess of Athens. Goddess of wisdom, weaving, and art, Demeter, Ceres, goddess of fertility and harvest, her daughter. Persephone, was kidnapped by Hades and taken to the underworld, Hades, Pluto, god of the underworld. Ares, Mars, god of war, Hermes, Mercury, messenger god, often depicted with a winged helmet. Artemis, Diana, virgin goddess of the hunt and wilderness, Poseidon, Neptune, god of the sea, depicted carrying a trident.
What was the orchard factory?
The orchard factory was a Chinese imperial palace workshop during the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644. The orchard factory primarily produced lacquered wood, furniture and decorative objects of astonishing quality. Lacquer is a clear wood finish derived from tree sap that acts as a preserver. Lacquer can be colored with pigments. Multiple layers of lacquer can be carved, and it can also be inlaid with precious stones and metals. A fine example of the lacquer work likely produced by the orchard factory is a Ming-era folding chair dating from the mid-16th century, now at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The folding chair, used by Chinese emperors while traveling, is ornately decorated with stylized dragon and lotus flower motifs.
What is medieval?
The medieval period, also referred to as the Middle Ages. Is the name given to the period of European history from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the beginning of the Italian Renaissance in the 14th century. These terms are generally derogatory, and are linked to the humanist idea that the 1,000 years between the Classical Age and the Renaissance were somehow dark or barbaric. In actuality, however, European art from this period was rich and innovative, drawing inspiration from the diverse cultures thriving in Europe at the time.
What was the Ottoman Empire?
The Ottoman Empire was a Turkish state founded in the 13th century by Osman I, who then expanded his territories, eventually dislodging Byzantine rulers and taking over Constantinople in 1453. Constantinople, now called Istanbul, became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which by the 15th century controlled large portions of North Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire was one of the longest-lasting powers in history, only falling in 1922 when Turkey became a republic.
What is the animal style?
Animal style is a term art historians use to describe the zoomorphic or animal-based design motifs popular among Anglo-Saxon artisans during the medieval period. In the animal style, abstract animal motifs merge with geometric and organic motifs, creating a lively and intricate pattern, especially in metalwork. One of the most famous examples of the animal style is a purse cover from the Sutton Hoo burial ship. The purse cover is about 8 inches long and would have been used to cover a leather pouch for carrying coins. The purse was designed with interweaving bands of gold, surrounding deep blue and red plagues of enamel and garnet. A pair of highly stylized human figures with splayed legs are each flanked by a pair of wolves. Serpentine lines undulate around the curving form of the purse cover, broken into rhythmic rectangles. A study of Anglo-Saxon decorative arts, such as the Sutton Hoo purse cover, show the influence of many medieval cultures, such as Germanic tribes, Vikings, and Christians.
What is Buddhism?
Buddhism developed in India during the Mauryan period, 322 to 185 B. CE, and became the official religion of Emperor Ashoka, who ruled between 273 and 232 BCE. Buddhism is founded upon the teachings of Buddha, the Enlightened One. Buddha was born Siddhartha Gautama, a wealthy prince. It was foretold that Siddhartha would become either a great military leader or a fully awakened being after he reached enlightenment. The Buddha held his first teachings in which he explained the Four Noble Truths. The Noble Truths make up the foundation of Buddhist philosophy. They are as follows: life is dukkha, translated as suffering, stress, or dissatisfaction. The cause of dukkha is tanha, translated as craving or clinging. Dukkha can be extinguished. The way to extinguish dukkha is by following the Eightfold Path in the Buddhist tradition. The Eightfold Path is a set of principles for achieving nirvana, a state in which one escapes from the recurring cycle of death and rebirth and is free from dukkha. The Buddha's teaching is often symbolized as a wheel, known as the wheel of law.
What is Beadoin?
Beadoin is a Buddhist temple originally built during the Heian period in a mountainous region near Kyoto. Considered one of the most beautiful Pure Land Buddhist temples. Beadoin is also known as Phoenix Hall because of two bronze phoenixes on the roof, and because the building's upswept rooflines are considered bird-like. It sits in front of a reflecting pond designed in the shape of the Sanskrit letter A, which is the sacred symbol of the Amida Buddha.
What is the art of Benin?
Benin, also known as the Edo Empire, was an important African state that lasted from 1440 to 1897. The heart of the empire, Benin City, was located about 150 miles away from Ile-Ife in Nigeria. Similar to Ile-Ife, Benin had a long tradition of memorial sculpture and shrines were built in honor of deceased obas, or kings. Popular materials for sculpture included ivory and bronze, and it is partly because of the use of these durable materials that more art from Benin has survived than from other African cultures from this time period. The power of the Edo Empire peaked in the 16th century and succumbed to the British Empire towards the end of the 19th century. Many of Benin's art treasures are now part of the British Museum and other Western institutions.
What are the symbolic meanings of the many objects in the Marode altarpiece?
The Marode altarpiece is filled with religious symbolism related to the Annunciation. On the table next to Mary are lilies in a vase. The lilies represent Mary's purity, and the fact that there are three of them suggest the Holy Trinity. Next to the lilies is a candle. The candle's flame has been recently extinguished and the wick smokes gently. This is a symbol of Christ's incarnation. A small image of infant Christ holding a wooden cross can be seen in the upper left. He flies on a ray of light and has just entered the room through a closed yet unbroken window, which is a reference to Mary's virginity. In the back of the room is a small, brass basin and washcloth, symbols of Christ who cleanses the sins of the world. In the right panel, Saint Joseph, Mary's husband, is making mousetraps. This might sound strange, but the activity symbolizes St. Joseph's role as protector of Mary and Christ and shows him as a family man.
Was John Singer Sargent an Impressionist?
Not exactly. John Singer Sargent, 1856 to 1925, was a supporter of Impressionism and dabbled in the movement. But his interest in light did not extend all the way to completely dissolving any forms in his work, as was common with the Impressionists. Sargent was born in Florence to wealthy American parents, but spent the majority of his career painting portraits for members of high society in Britain and France. He was highly successful as a portraitist and tended towards realism. He was roundly criticized, during his lifetime and after, for making superficial art. In 1929, the art critic Roger Fry called Sargent undistinguished as an illustrator and non-existent as an artist, as quoted in Sargent, John. However, since the 1970s his reputation has been on the rise. Scholars now note Sargent's ability to emphasize psychological drama in works such as Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. 1882, which recalls the sophistication of Velázquez's Las Meninas. His most famous portrait, Madame X, 1883 to 1884, caused a scandal for its twisted pose and sexuality. While at the time it was a disappointment, it is now acclaimed for its juxtaposition of the pale porcelain skin of Madame X, Madame Pierre Gautreau, with the soft, velvety texture of her skin-tight black dress. In his later years working in Boston, Sargent painted mostly watercolors, preferring to distance himself from portraiture. Though he was not really an impressionist, Sargent is now considered an innovative 19th-century artist who occasionally painted with an impressionist palette.
What is the difference between Christian and Islamic architecture?
When looking at examples of Christian and Islamic religious architecture, one might be surprised that there are often many similarities. Both churches and mosques often feature central domes, and some early mosques, like the Dome of the Rock, resemble centrally planned churches in their use of the ambulatory. While the nave of a basilica plan church is often filled with pews. Mosques have open floor plans, which allows Muslims to kneel and pray using prayer rugs. The exterior of a mosque is notable for its tall minarets, which are not used in church architecture. Though both styles emphasize monumental height and grandeur. In terms of decoration, many, though certainly not all, Christian churches are filled with mosaics, painted narrative scenes, and stained glass windows featuring stories from the Bible. Mosque decoration also features passages from the Quran, however. This is visualized using calligraphy, due to Islam's iconoclastic approach to art. Both early churches and mosques rely heavily on mosaics for decoration.
Who was Caravaggio?
Michelangelo Merisi, 1571 to 1610, better known as Caravaggio, was a complicated artist. He never had a workshop or any apprentices, and seemed more comfortable in the dark alleys of Rome than in the grand churches and palaces of his high-status patrons. Prone to violence, Caravaggio frequently ran into trouble with the law. In 1606, he killed a man in a street fight, prompting the Pope to issue a warrant for his death. He was, however, one of the greatest naturalist painters in history. And his powerfully realistic paintings promoted Christian themes of redemption and salvation. Caravaggio was also a skilled still life painter. One of his most notable still lifes is Basket of Fruit, 1597. Against a yellow background, a wicker basket filled with aging fruits and leaves sits on a window ledge. The purple grapes are starting to turn a moldy gray color. Green leaves are wilting, some are covered in brown spots. A red and yellow apple is browning around two apparent wormholes. The former sheen and health of this fruit is apparent, but only a slight tinge of life remains. The basket of fruit is so close to the picture plane that it is almost confrontational, forcing the viewer to notice the passing of time. The painting has been interpreted as symbolic of the fleetingness of youth and beauty.
What is a mosque lamp?
Mosque lamps are oil lamps, most closely associated with the medieval period, and characterized by a bulbous middle and flared top. Often enameled or made of glass, they are extremely fragile but well cared for because the light of a mosque lamp was associated with the light of God. Many mosque lamps were commissioned by Mamluk sultans in Egypt during the 13th century and were inscribed with verses from the Quran.
What was revolutionary about the Last Supper?
Completed between 1495 to 1498 in the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. The Last Supper is considered by some to be Leonardo da Vinci's greatest work, sorry, Mona Lisa. It is a fresco, which means it was painted on a freshly plastered wall. And it depicts the biblical scene in which Jesus Christ breaks bread with his followers on the evening before his death. It was considered revolutionary for a number of reasons, including its naturalism. Da Vinci chose to depict the moment when Christ declares that one of them will betray him. The apostles gathered around the table with Jesus are shocked. Saint John cannot bear it and simply faints at hearing the news. Saint Peter is angered, and pulls out his knife. foreshadowing his use of the weapon when Jesus is betrayed by Judas in a later part of the biblical narrative. For the first time in art history, Judas is shown on the same side of the table as Christ. Though he leans away, betraying his guilt to the viewer. Like other works of Renaissance art, the story is clearly visually articulated. The apostles are organized into 4 groups of 3, and are all aligned on one side of the table. There are 3 windows behind the table, and 3 dark niches along each side. 3 being associated with the Holy Trinity. Despite the shock of the news, the painting is calm and the mood is thoughtful. Da Vinci's Last Supper was a major influence on other artists who painted the same scene, including Tintoretto, Hans Holbein, and Rubens.
Who were the Etruscans?
The Etruscan civilization flourished in Italy for nearly 500 years. Until the Etruscans were conquered by the Romans in 509 BCE. They controlled a fertile region known as Etruria, now called Tuscany. The art and culture of the ancient Etruscans were certainly influenced by the ancient Greeks. In fact, the Etruscans adopted a number of Greek gods into their pantheon. But, they also maintained a unique tradition of their own, and went on to influence the ancient Romans who absorbed their culture.
What is jasperware?
Developed by the English potter Josiah Wedgwood, jasperware is a type of porcelain best known for its popular white-on-blue unglazed finish, though various other colors were also used, and neoclassical design. Wedgwood hired sculptor John Flaxman to recreate highly popular molded relief images that closely mimicked ancient Greek vase designs, which had been recently discovered. Jasperware was effectively marketed and manufactured on a large scale, making Wedgwood's neoclassical designs available to a wider public than decorative objects made before the Industrial Revolution. Jasperware, and Wedgwood pottery as a whole, remain very popular to this day.
What is a historiad capital?
An innovative element of Romanesque church decoration. A historiated capital is a space just above a column that illustrates a compressed narrative. Flight into Egypt is a 12th century historiated capital in the French Cathedral of Saint-Lazare. Attributed to the sculptor master Gisli Berthouz. The scene depicts the Madonna and Child riding a donkey, led by Saint Joseph. Mary looks straight ahead while St. Joseph leans forward, his body conforming to the trapezoidal shape of the capital. More than mere decoration. This historiated capital serves to educate by representing symbolic stories 94 from the Bible.
Why is the Leaning Tower of Pisa leaning?
The Leaning Tower of Pisa, or Campanile, Italian for bell tower, is part of a larger cathedral complex uniformly designed in white marble. The tower, built between 1171 and 1271, started to lean even before construction was completed because of the soft ground upon which it was built, and because the base was too small for the nearly 180-foot height of the tower. The builders tried to adapt to the lean during construction, and a slight bend is noticeable in the upper floors. This did not work. In the last few decades, structural engineers have excavated underneath the tower in order to stabilize it.
Who were the Brahmins?
Felix Brachmand, 1833 to 1914, and his wife Marie, 1840 to 1916, were both artists associated with the Impressionist style and were part of the artistic social circle that included Degas, Rodin, Manet, and Whistler. Felix was mostly a printmaker and specialized in etching. He is credited with popularizing Japanese prints, known as ukiyo-e. Amongst the Impressionists, especially the work of Hokusai, Marie Brachmand was primarily a painter and began her career by designing decorative porcelain, which attracted the attention of Degas. Though largely absent from art history survey texts, Marie Brachmand was one of the premier women artists of the 19th century. Her career was not well supported by her husband, and she did not produce a body of work as large as her contemporaries. Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot, however. Her work was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1874 and she exhibited at multiple Impressionist shows as well.
Who was Francisco Goya?
Francisco Goya y Lucians, 1746 to 1828, was a Spanish Romantic painter who lived to see Napoleon Bonaparte absorb Spain into his empire, a violent massacre of the people by the new government. The restoration of the Spanish monarchy, and the reinstitution of the Spanish Inquisition. Goya, who at one time was the court painter for Spanish King Charles IV, and painted a perhaps too realistic, arguably unflattering portrait of the royal family in 1800, was inspired by the Enlightenment ideas of the French Revolution and deeply disappointed by the failure of those ideas to instill fundamental change in Spain. Charles IV cracked down hard on social change, even banning the entry of books into the country. Goya's series of 80 etchings, Los Caprichos, the Caprices, completed between 1796 and 1798. Respond to what Goya perceived of as the folly of the Spanish people at the time. The Sleep of Reason produces Monsters, an aquatint etching from this series. Depicts reason personified as a slouched, sleeping figure. While reason is preoccupied by slumber, ominous creatures emerge from the darkness, including owls, bats, and a cat with wide, glowing eyes. Goya's work suggests the genius of Velázquez, the satire of Hogarth, and the refinement of Reynolds, while illustrating a highly individual and complex imagination steeped in Spanish mysticism and superstition. Other important paintings by Goya include 3rd of May, 1808, 1814 to 1815, which commemorates the massacre of Spanish prisoners by the French. Dark paintings such as Saturn devouring one of his children, 1820 to 1823, and many portraits.
What is photorealism?
Photorealism, also called superrealism, sharp focus realism, and hyperrealism, developed in the 1970s as an extension of minimalism and pop art. It can even be considered a great-grandchild to precisionism. Photorealistic paintings were influenced by photographic and media images, and like pop art, often feature impersonal, even banal subject matter inspired by everyday life. American photorealist artist Chuck Close, 1940, makes paintings so realistic that they seem like photographs by using a photo as a reference and painting his image on a grid with an airbrush. The artist Audrey Flack, 1931, creates photorealistic still life paintings that recall Baroque Vanitas paintings. Photorealism often relies on trompe-l'oeil, which means trick of the eye to communicate meaning and comment on social, political, and cultural themes. Other artists associated with photorealism include Robert Bechtel, 1932, Richard Estes, 1932, and British artist Malcolm Morley, 1931.
Who was Diego Rivera?
Diego Rivera, 1886 to 1957, was an internationally renowned Mexican artist known for creating monumental public murals. Like Picasso, who he met while studying in Europe, Rivera was a child prodigy. During his early career, he went through a synthetic cubist phase. However, his mature style is characterized by large, figurative murals. Diego Rivera, along with other important Mexican artists such as José Clemente Orozco and David Alfaro Siqueiros, aimed to create a new national art for Mexico. He studied frescoes in Italy and applied the technique to his murals, such as his series of Mexican history paintings at the Palacio Nacional, National Palace, in Mexico City, which blends European with Mayan and Aztec styles and features rich, bold colors and simplified forms. Rivera also completed murals in the United States, including his depiction of Detroit industry, 1932 to 1933, at the Detroit Institute of Art. A vocal communist, Rivera's politics sometimes caused criticism in America. while working on a commission from the Rockefeller family in New York. For example, Rivera planned to add a portrait of Russian leader Vladimir Lenin. The Rockefellers refused, paid Rivera's fee, and destroyed his unfinished mural. Rivera ended up completing a different version of the mural, called Man. Controller of the Universe, 1934, at the Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes. Museum of Fine Art, which is one of Rivera's most celebrated works.
What is Baroque classicism?
Baroque classicism is a specific style of Baroque art that draws heavily on classical influences and is characterized by refined idealism, realism, and an interest in antiquity. The dramatic use of chiaroscuro is not quite as evident in Baroque classicism. It was most popular in France, and preferred by the painters such as Nicolas Poussin, Claude Lorraine, Charles Lebrun, and the architect Louis Vaux. Some art historians consider the Italian Annibale Carracci, whose work greatly influenced Poussin, a classicist as well.
What is Dada?
Dada was an anti-rational, anti-establishment movement that began in Europe. Dada was concerned with upending tradition and embracing chance, anarchism, and new forms of art making. The word Dada itself is essentially meaningless and was supposedly chosen from the dictionary at random by a group of artists and writers in Zurich, Switzerland, in 1916. The sound Dada is childish, and reminiscent of a baby's first words. Dada was a reaction against the horrors of World War I, though earlier movements such as Cubism and the writing of Kandinsky certainly inspired it as well. Dada's influence spread and notable Dada groups were established in Germany, Paris, Barcelona, and New York. Artists associated with Dada include André Breton, 1896–1966, Jean, Hans Arp, 1886–1966, Marcel Duchamp, 1887–1968, and Man Ray, 1890–1976.
What is feminist art?
Feminist art began in the 1960s. Developing out of the politically and socially motivated women's liberation movement. The goal of feminist art was to reinterpret art history, which was deemed to be systematically sexist, and to promote women's contributions to art and culture. Women have been making art throughout history, and yet art made by women, for example, ceramics, jewelry, and textiles, has traditionally been categorized as a craft, which is held in less regard than so-called works of fine art, such as painting or sculpture. Feminist artists aimed to raise the status of craft. much in the way that Renaissance artists aimed to raise the status of the artist during the 16th and 17th centuries. During the 1960s and 1970s, men were disproportionately represented by art galleries. And women artists formed their own groups and collective galleries to promote their work. Feminist art groups included War, Women Artists in Revolution, and the Feminist Art Program. Established by pioneering feminist artists Judy Chicago, 1939, and Miriam Shapiro, 1923, in Southern California. Artists who worked with the early feminist art movement were also associated with other movements and styles, including minimalism, conceptual art, and installation art.
What is the work of Ace?
Also known as the carved vase of Uruk, the work of Ace is a 3-foot tall alabaster vase found by archaeologists near the White Temple. The vase is decorated with stories that have been divided into registers, or bands. Almost like a comic strip that tells a story of humans making offerings to the gods. The lowest register depicts the natural world of water and plants, while above this are domesticated animals. The middle register features nude men holding baskets, and the top register shows a king giving an offering to the Sumerian goddess Inanna. The figures in the registers are shown with their heads and legs in profile view, but with torsos and shoulders in a 3/4 view.
What was the Aztec religion?
The Aztec religion was influenced by the beliefs and mythologies of other Mesoamerican cultures such as the Olmec, Maya, Teotihuacan, and Toltec. As in other Mesoamerican religions, human sacrifice was an important part of the religion, and was linked to cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The Aztec emphasized the importance of the sun as well as over 1,000 powerful, yet occasionally fallible, deities. Huitzilopochtli was the god of war and the sun who, according to mythology, led the Aztecs to the location where they founded the city of Tenochtitlan. One of the most popular deities was the heroic Quetzalcoatl, who was often depicted in art as a feathered serpent. Religion was an extremely important part of everyday life for the Aztecs.
Who was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec?
Artists such as Cezanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh sacrificed three-dimensional realism in an attempt to express a new kind of authenticity, or truth, in their work. The result was pictures that often looked flat, and emphasized boldness of color over depth and space. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, 1864–1901, made paintings and posters that shared many of these qualities. Toulouse-Lautrec was fascinated by the Bohemian Montmartre, an entertainment district in Paris where many Impressionist artists lived and worked, including Edgar Degas, who was a major influence on Toulouse-Lautrec. He was physically impaired due to a combination of illness and childhood accidents, which resulted in stunted growth in his legs and difficulty with mobility. Perhaps because of this, he was enamored with the dance halls and nightclubs of Montmartre. And many of his elegant paintings and posters illustrate lively dancers and cafe patrons chatting, moving, and having a great time. His painting, At the Moulin Rouge, 1892 to 1895, depicts a scene at one of the most popular clubs in Paris at the time, the Moulin Rouge. To the far right, a green-faced dancer, May Milton, is reminiscent of Degas dancers under the sharp artificial lights of the theater. At some point in history, someone cut her out of the picture, possibly due to her strange appearance and scandalous personality in real life, though the cut piece has since been reattached. Toulouse-Lautrec's posters, such as Moulin Rouge, La Gaulieu, 1891, feature outlined forms and flat colors similar to Japanese woodblock prints.
Who is Gabriel Orozco?
Gabriel Orozco, 1962, is a Mexican artist from Jalapa, Veracruz, whose work, including sculpture, photographs, and installations, often subtly alters found objects and is intellectually complex. For example, in the early 1990s, Orozco chopped up a Citroën DS automobile and reduced its width by 2/3. Making us think differently about commonly perceived objects.
Can a video game be a work of art?
All works of art, but perhaps most obviously installation art, rely upon the participation of viewer to generate meaning. When you go to a gallery and look the art, your thoughts and experiences affect the meaning of the art you see and interpret. This exchange is naturally extended to the concept of gameplay and video games. Game theory and game art have been a fruitful source of artistic exploration for years. In 2001, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art exhibited Game Show. And in 2012 the Smithsonian American Art Museum held a show called, The Art of Video Games. The show's curator, Chris Melisinos, explained that through the video game medium, we are invited by the artist to inject our own morality, our own worldview, our own experiences into the game as we play it. And what comes out is wholly different from everybody that experiences it, the art of video games. Like other forms of digital art, video game art is very young. And generations of innovative artists will likely mine the medium for its theoretical and aesthetic potential in the years to come.
Were there any professional women artists during the 15th and 16th centuries?
Yes. There were many highly regarded women artists working during the Renaissance and the years after in both Italy and Northern Europe. Here are just a few of the approximately 30 known women. Properzia de Rossi, 1490–1530, Bolognese miniature painter and sculptor trained by Marcantonio Raimondi Lavina Tierlink, c. 1510–1576, miniature painter who worked for the English courts of Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Received high acclaim, though none of her works survive. Caterina van Hemessen, c.1527–c.1566, painted portraits and religious scenes, worked for the court of Mary, regent of the Netherlands and later the Spanish court. Sophonisba Anguissa, 1531–1626, Cremonese painter who served as a court painter for King Philip II of Spain. Sister Lucia was also a skilled artist. Diana Scultori c. 1547–1612, an engraver also known as Diana Mantovana or Diana Mantuana, first woman to be permitted to print and sell her work under her own name. Lavinia Fontana, 1552–1614, mother of 11 children, commissioned to paint the martyrdom of St.
What is Cubism?
Cubism was a revolutionary development in modernist art that began in the early 20th century and lasted for decades. Cubism is characterized by fragmented images, or images that have been broken up and viewed from multiple angles. Cubism has its roots in the post-impressionist work of Paul Cézanne and primitivism. It is most closely associated with the work of Picasso and Georges Braque. 1882–1963, as well as Juan Gris, 1887–1927, and Fernand Léger, 1881–1955. Cubism can be considered an attempt to distill complex visual images into an aesthetically unified whole. Cubist artists are interested in capturing the essence of an object and placing it in visual context. The development of Cubism has been linked by some scholars to the massive cultural and social changes taking place during the turn of the century, including enormous changes in technology and industry. Cubism is divided into various phases, the earliest of which are analytic cubism and synthetic cubism. Analytic cubism was developed by Picasso and Braque in 1909. A good example of analytic cubism is Braque's Violin and Palette. 1909–1910, in which the image of a violin has been fragmented, as if the violin was made of shattered glass that has been swept up into a pile of crystal-like shards. Each shard of the violin is visually analyzed in the painting, allowing the viewer to contemplate the physical characteristics of the instrument in a new way. During the analytic cubist phase, Picasso and Braque painted objects that were almost, but not completely, dissolved into abstraction. By contrast, synthetic cubism is characterized by simple forms, less abstraction, and the use of collage, a process in which the artist applies elements, such as newspaper, to the canvas with glue. Examples of synthetic cubism include Picasso's still life with mandolin and guitar, 1924, and his collage piece, Glass and Bottle of Susie, 1912. Cubism was revolutionary for a number of reasons. It was the first modern art movement in which artists experimented with near-total abstraction. And it went on to inspire other art movements, including suprematism, futurism, and constructivism.